How often do your employees forget to clock out, resulting in unauthorized overtime that their manager or HR never approved to begin with? And this, of course, resulting in higher labor costs at the end of the day. Whether or not it's intentional on the employee's side, you are not alone. This is exactly why I brought on John Woodworth. He is the owner of Do Diligence LLC and an operations consultant. And today we're going to talk a lot about how to stop unauthorized overtime for hourly staff. So we really cover it all here. We talk about how to spot unauthorized overtime before it happens, how to stay on top of last minute scheduling changes, and then what the implications are if unauthorized overtime does in fact happen, and how to handle it at the end of the day. We'll get right into it and stick around. Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Meredith Gershenson. I'm a research analyst here at workforce.com. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about how to stop unauthorized overtime. Workforce.com, to give a little background on us as a company, we are a full service HCM software company that specializes for businesses with hourly staff. So it's everything from scheduling to payroll to time and attendance to HRIS and so much more. Here at Workforce, we actually work with thousands of hourly staffed organizations, and that really allows us insight into overtime and labor cost savings. So our software has actually helped them stay on top of overtime and scheduling conflicts, and more importantly, remain compliant with FLSA laws across the US. Today, I am joined by John Woodrow. John, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Meredith, for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
Of course. So Woody is the owner of Do Diligence LLC and operations consultant. He has a unique background offering expertise in many areas across the board. Currently, he consults and mentors his clients in the areas of leadership, continuous improvement, strategic operations, and organizational change. During Woody's 18-year career at General Mills, he has also led multiple manufacturing facilities, having ultimate accountability for delivering financial service production results with a focus toward employee, consumer, and environmental responsibility and safety. Awesome. Okay, you're the perfect man for the job, Woody. I'm telling you, this is going to be an awesome conversation. First and foremost, tell me about, your experience in the manufacturing industry and running frontline teams.
Yeah, I've had the awesome pleasure to lead some great teams from, like you mentioned, sites of 800 employees to sites of 30 employees. I led a customer service organization, a call center early in my career, and I was an HR manager early in my career. So I've got to see this from not only C-suite executive, but also being a frontline leader in multiple departments.
How do you define unauthorized, sometimes known as unplanned overtime?
Yeah, maybe to separate that a little bit, I see unauthorized is more like unapproved overtime. So somebody's working overtime that hasn't been approved by management. It's not on a schedule. Versus unplanned, to me, is more like tomorrow we need to work overtime because sales are greater than what we had anticipated. We need an extra day of production this week. And we're asking everybody to do that. And it was unplanned.
Yeah, I think that distinction's really important to know. It does kind of cross some lines. I think it depends on, who you're talking to, size of business, what their own definition is. But yeah, I think that distinction's huge, right? Unauthorized, we're talking about something that an employee maybe thinks that they're doing a good deed, right? They think that they're logging in some extra hours. In reality, it's not approved by the manager, it's not approved by HR, and that costs the company. At the end of the day, it actually has a huge demerit on labor costs, right? Where unplanned, right, as you said, something where, hey, it looks like it's a busy season, it's Black Friday, something's happening, we got to have more staff on board within the next hour, within the next day or two. So that is something that is, again, a very important distinction. When running multiple manufacturing plants, how often would you have to deal with unauthorized overtime in your day-to-day?
As I mentioned, I've worked in large facilities, some with incredibly complex schedules. For example, in one facility, 400 employees, we had 3 people dedicated to employee scheduling because there were so many rules. On the other side, I've worked in startups where small, and the smaller, in that startup arena, we wear multiple hats. And I would say it was a every other day conversation in the startups and definitely weekly. And I'll give some examples as we probably talk about this of how we had to try to manage that. But at a minimum, a weekly conversation, irregardless of the size of the organization, because it is a very important key performance indicator.
When you're doing consulting work, how often, would unauthorized overtime come up with some of the managers that you would work with?
Yeah, I would say it's come up every time, but people don't know that's what they're asking about. This comes through in a conversation about, hey, Woody, we need your help in operational efficiencies or continuous improvement. And we'll get talking about what is their schedule and is it predictable and does it meet the business needs? And in most cases, the inefficiencies are driving the can't meet the business needs, which is driving the unplanned Saturday, Sundays, time and a half, double time, etc. And usually where my clients need my help is how do we find improvements in those efficiencies to create consistency. Business wants consistency, employees want consistency in their schedule. You put something on the board that says, I'm going to work this day. I want to know I'm going to work that day.
Yeah. I think that aspect of consistency is going to be a running trend in this whole webinar, right? Where that's going to be the primary indicator. And it perfectly leads me into this first topic, talking about spotting unauthorized overtime before it happens, which seems very contradictory. But again, as you said, I really think that aspect of consistency being key feeds into this pretty well. Focusing on this first slide, if we share our screen here, common indicators of unauthorized overtime, what that looks like, maybe these top 4 common indicators that we laid out here from a greatworkforce.com article. My question for you, John, is what are some common indicators that unauthorized overtime might be occurring?
Yeah. So as we talk about this topic, I first want to say, I'm a very relational person. Relationships with employees are very important in culture. And at times, probably during this conversation, it's going to sound like, well, you got to put these guidelines in place. You feel like you're the police a little bit. So I just want everyone to have the context. I'm coming from strong culture is the rock. Fundamentally, I think 3 things. One is on this unauthorized, an employee doesn't have knowledge. They don't know that I need, overtime authorized, or I don't know what the guidelines are. To me, that employee cares. There's a lack of understanding. The guidelines, the rules, etc., haven't been explained. I didn't know I needed authorization. I was trying to do the right thing. I was a mechanic working on equipment that was down, and it carried past my shift. I'm trying to do the right thing. That employee cares. Then there's the intentional act. It's the employee knows, they know they need it authorized, and they're trying to get a little extra dollars in the pocket, if you will. So as that is kind of the foundation, some of the things I would say to be looking for is, are employees, for example, gathering in areas where they normally wouldn't gather at times you wouldn't expect them to gather, like in a locker room. You see somebody coming out of a locker room 20 minutes after the end of the shift, or again at odd times. Do you see employees in areas you wouldn't normally see them, especially when a leader has gone home for the day, if you will? And probably employees not in normal working areas. Those would be some things as I'm just walking around, visualizing, look a little abnormal to beg me to ask some more questions.
Can you share any specific strategies or even tools that have kind of helped proven effective in monitoring, these employee hours, right? And making sure, hey, everybody's where they need to be, there's no sketchy behavior going around, no unauthorized overtime happening under your nose, right? Is there any tools that you can recommend there?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I'm thinking about. Is first, if your organization is large enough where you have frontline leaders, engage them. You want
Mm,
this to be a multifaceted, multi-area key performance indicator, not just HR's monitoring, but operations has ownership in this key performance indicator. So you want frontline leaders engaged, especially in the approval process. They are the ones, the leader. If you have an employee on a line and they report to, let's say, a first shift supervisor, you want that person approving the time. I think that's important. I think of an example where a facility of about 100 employees, and we ended up doing a weekly review. And a reason that came about is in California, if an employee does not get their half an hour lunchtime, uh, then you need to pay them an hour extra of time. And so that became very expensive once that was discovered this was happening. Again, some of that was unintentional, people clocking out early. Hey, I want to get back to my workstation, if you will. So we just started monitoring that week by week and going employee by employee. And I will
mhm,
say it was very painful up front. There was some intentionality of me calling that meeting to cause a little pain of like, that we're going to have to go employee by employee, make sure people understand what's happening and also what the consequences are of not adhering to what the guidelines were that we had. Um, and we did that review with HR. It was an HR operations team effort, if you will. Maybe one other example, a facility again in California, and I call this kind of unintended consequences. Is we had a disgruntled employee who was asking for certain things, but they went and looked at everything. And it wasn't a reason for the lawsuit, but discovered that our employees, these were 12-hour shifts, were not getting their lunch break before the fifth hour.
mhm.
And what was happening was employees were self-deciding this was a high performance organization
Right.
to, hey, we have sanitation going. Let's work through sanitation and we will take our lunch break after sanitation is done.
Mm,
Well, the burden is on the employer, not the employee. And everybody was trying to do the best of intentions, but that was a six-figure payout
oh,
because
wow.
that had not been, I will say, administered. So we became much more visual in terms of, even in a high performance communication, of that employee schedule, who, when, and where.
Mm.
Who's working, when are they working, and where are they working?
It actually reminds me a lot of a client that we had. I'm not gonna, name any names here, but we have a client and they had a similar issue, right? Where managers essentially, again, as you said, it was on the employer, it was on the manager side of things where they weren't letting employees know, hey, this is your time to go on break. Employees were kind of running around. It was a little disorganized, quite frankly, on the internals of the company. And it was really hard for managers to pinpoint, especially with the organization this large. I believe it was around like 10,000 staff. They fluctuate season to season, but it was really hard for managers to kind of have a sense of what breaks need to be taken where, who should be taking these breaks, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, they got on board with Workforce, right? They have the time tracking app. And this pretty much allows managers to actually get notified on their phones on the employee, or excuse me, on the workforce.com app saying, hey, this employee hasn't taken their break yet, or hey, this employee needs to take a break in a couple minutes, in an hour or so. Make sure you let them know, or hey, this is the employee you kind of need to be chasing down right now. And it really made it a lot more streamlined for managers to actually go ahead and do that, right? And make sure,
Yeah.
hey, these are the FLSA laws that we are abiding by. Here's what we need to do. And especially in states like California, right? It is so strict, and employees are so educated in today's day and age where they are able, you see lawsuits popping up every day, a lot of those being in California because the employee laws are so strict there. So it's so important that managers are staying on top of it. And it's a lot of pressure, and a lot of these managers are just promoted frontline employees themselves, right? They need to also be educated and, using technology, leaning on technology for things like this. It's exactly why it's here, right?
To build on that, I think of an example of where we use the technology, basically the time clocks, making sure that people, so those required donning and doffing, so there were required PPEs that were required, so we were paying for that time that we felt. You have to check your local kind of laws on that, but that donning and doffing and whether you pay for it or not, is it instrumental to the function of the job, if you will? Let's say somebody needs to wear a hazmat suit and they need to wear that before they start. From my knowledge, you should be paying for that time because it's a critical piece of their job, if you will. And you're asking them to do that before they start minute one.
Yeah.
So even in those areas, you can use your time clock to say, we're giving 7 minutes for that time. And the time clock doesn't allow somebody to punch in until that 7 minute mark.
Yeah.
Or same thing with lunches in, lunches out. You can't punch out early, that type of thing. So I would say use that technology to your advantage. Make sure you're communicating that you're doing that. And also, if you have the technology, like you said, Meredith, that's linked to your phone to give notices to those frontline leaders, hey, somebody just clocked out and it was 15 minutes late. They should be aware of that.
And I think you bring up a really great point, right? You can point to technology as the bad guy in the situation, right? It doesn't need to be the manager that's taking on the brunt. You can say, oh, unfortunately, our system is automatic, so you can only clock in right at this hour. I'm so sorry about that. It's just how it is. Point to the technology. You can blame the third party.
Exactly.
We're here to be blamed.
Yep. As long as, again, everybody knows that's the deal. Yep.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You talked a little bit about how you are someone who kind of feeds a little bit of that HR, relational aspect into your managerial role. So what role does, effective communication actually play in preventing unauthorized overtime, especially in industries where shifts and schedules can vary, sometimes day to day?
Yeah. This is the most important thing. Something that really drove me when I was younger in my career. My father worked in a factory for 44 years, same place, for the most part, the same job. And what I experienced when I was younger is he found out every Thursday whether he worked Saturday or not. And that blew up many family plans. And I vowed to myself, like, I'm not going to be in that situation with any of my teams. How would any of us, most of us who are probably listening on this call, have a lot of flexibility with their own schedules? And many of our employees don't have that same flexibility. And some of that just goes with the territory, but also we are responsible as leaders to make sure we're providing some of that consistency and communication. So I tried to always give employees like at least 2 weeks notice if we could do that. And so that communication, very, very visual, whether that's through monitors or if you don't have that technology, there's a place everybody can go. And I'm talking about even in high performance organizations. I led a team that we actually, when the teams first formed, we put them through some Dale Carnegie effective communication and leadership and building. And their first task was to decide on their own work schedule within parameters that we had set up. And those parameters were so important. And those parameters all came down to communication. So communication is so critical employees want that consistency. So even if you don't have the technology to put that, visually, do you have a bulletin board? I think of another example. In a facility, we had 800 employees. On each of the teams, we had somebody assigned the role of employee scheduler, if you will, and they were the ones communicating back to the team. So be a little creative, get employees engaged, but make that very visual. When people, back to the who's working, when are they working, where are they working?
It really feeds me well into this next topic, talking about staying on top of scheduling changes with communication in place. So looking at this next slide, if I can get it up, here we go. Awesome. So looking at this next slide, talk about improving your internal communication. I'm curious, because obviously shift-based industries like manufacturing, food and beverage, healthcare, whatever you're talking here, are constantly changing in terms of schedules. As we said, how should HR and ops teams actually ensure that any alterations to their schedules are communicated, and to employees to actually minimize that risk of unauthorized overtime?
Collectively, like HR and ops together should be discussing like what are those parameters, like, hey, all unauthorized overtime needs approval, or are there exceptions, like the example I gave before, a mechanic is in the middle of a machine at their shift changed. Do you want them to go try to track down their manager and might lose 20 minutes to a half an hour trying to track them down, and who's going to approve this? Again, are there situations where and maybe that's more unplanned, that's an unplanned overtime. But at the end of the day, it needs approval. Overtime needs approval, and somebody should sign off on that. So what is the vehicle to how that's going to happen? Do you have technology where that could happen on a phone? Does somebody need to sign up in advance for that overtime? That's the best case scenario. So then when you see somebody out of place, it's like, I didn't see their name on an overtime sign up board sheet, that type of thing. So working together to first determine what are the overtime parameters, if you will, especially when it comes to authorizing and who's going to authorize that overtime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it making sure that it's getting brought back to the manager at the end of the day, that they're the ones signing off on it. Is there any tools or communication practices, protocols that you've used that have actually found effective in keeping employees informed about changes to their schedules?
I've worked in union and non-union environments, and while I would always want my employees to speak on their own behalf, so that tells you kind of where I would lie on this. But sometimes in a union environment, what the benefit is you have a contract and it's laid out pretty clear. And usually in most union contracts, there's one of the major points of that contract is overtime. Who gets the overtime? What's the sequence? Who gets to sign up for it? What are the qualifications? I would implore those companies that are non-union to have some similar guidelines. When there is overtime, who qualifies?
Yeah.
And how do I sign up for that? And so to answer the question, it's what I've seen work is very visual on who is getting authorized for the overtime. So I have overtime today. At the end of the shift, Meredith, you're qualified, you're top seniority. We're asking you first, and we've communicated to everybody. Meredith has got it. So that way on the back end, Woody's not working because he just felt like it, and nobody knows because it hasn't been communicated.
Yeah.
So upfront communication, very visual on who's working.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it really does feed in with the aspect of educating yourself on, common laws, regulations, talking about exempt versus non-exempt employees, what that looks like for your state. it's really important, right, to stay on top of these kinds of things. I think, for us in terms of a tool, obviously within the technology side of things, we have a client, Green Force Staffing. They're a staffing agency for cannabis farms, actually. So they partner up with all these farms across Portland, Oregon, actually beyond Portland even. And I think they have, I want to say like 30 farms and growing, something like that, where they have a lot of people in a lot of different places, right? And they have a couple managers who head, teams and people at certain farms. They have relationships with these farm owners and people who are running them. And it's really hard for them to say, all right, I got to pinpoint this person. That by the time they email them to say, hey, make sure that you're clocked in here, or hey, this is the address they need to be at, whatever it is, it's really hard to get a hold of them, once they're already on the site or maybe not on the site. So having those in-app notifications is huge. We have the communication tool here. It's absolutely important that these managers are actually able to en masse talk to their team, or as individuals talk to team members, specifically these frontline workers who are switching out between farms and making sure that, hey, actually you're not at this farm today, you're at this farm. So having that communication tool is absolutely key. It makes sure that there's that top-down approach of communication really seamlessly. Again, by the time that you connect through them with an email, sometimes it's too late. So having those in-app notifications, having the popping up right on your phone screen is absolutely huge. And that's a tool that we've used with many clients on our end of things.
Yeah, to build on something you said there around the relationship and the communication. Again, there's some places where it's like somebody's working remotely. It's a little harder to maybe track them down. But if you're in a site, frontline leaders, this is about communication and personal relationship. So, and also there's in those guidelines and parameters, there's a coaching aspect. I'm sure, at least in my history, where you're trying to understand what happened the first time. Did the person know? Were they knowledgeable, or was this intentional? And you're putting somebody on notice by a coaching. You're trying to correct the behavior, but also in those guidelines have to be some progressive discipline, because unfortunately somebody probably in all of our walks of life are not going to follow those guidelines. And they need to know what the consequences are. Hey, we're giving you 1 or 2 coachings. After that, it's a verbal, it's a written, and we're going down a path, and all of that just needs to be above board. So when you have to go down the path with somebody, they absolutely know.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can think of examples. Portland, one example, when you said Portland, that I thought about was we had open campus in terms of you could leave for lunch, and an employee was leaving for lunch, coming back, then clocking out for lunch, taking the full half an hour. And that just took a conversation. And one chance, that's all it took, because there was a relationship already there. And making them understand the consequences of what it appeared, as in stealing from the company. And so, depending on your organization, the culture, that could have gone a lot of different ways. And we chose to give that employee one chance. And that ended up working out. And maybe if that employee didn't have a lot of time with us, we might have chose not to give a chance. But again, those rules were very clear up front. And usually when it's unauthorized and an employee is doing this intentionally, there's motivation. Motivation might be they're disgruntled about something else at work, the relationship with the manager. There's something they feel they've been unfairly treated, and this is the way I'm going to take care of it. Or there's something going on at home. I need a few extra dollars. I'm struggling to make ends meet, and this is the only way I need a few extra dollars. And again, that's why those relationships and those conversations are so critical.
Coming from that operations side of things and talking with HR, what do you say for HR and how they can better collaborate with operations and management teams to kind of smooth out that communication process when it comes to scheduling adjustments? Like, where can HR lend their hand here a little bit better?
Yeah. One is be a tool provider. So if you know the technology, your payroll time and attendance tracking systems better than anybody else, what are those tools you can provide to the frontline leaders, operations, informing them, hey, do you know our time clocks could set up a hard stop and start time? We could do 7 minutes. Oh, we have app technology, that type of thing. So be a provider of tools. Secondly, providing fundamental kind of like role playing, if you will, because some of these conversations aren't easy. When I as a frontline leader, maybe new in my job, and I've got to go approach somebody about, I think they've worked overtime that wasn't authorized. And how am I going to approach that? And the employee knows the severity of the situation and not just sweep it under the rug. So I think doing that in advance where frontline leaders feel comfortable having that conversation, or also letting them know, hey, if you're not comfortable, like, I'll partner up with you on this. Like, let's do this together. And I think thirdly, why it's so important that this is a joint KPI, not be with HR and operations or HR and sales, whoever you're working with, that it's not just HR's, because then it feels like HR's the police on this thing.
Were there any experiences that you've had with an HR manager that was specifically successful, where they had, your back kind of through and through? They came at the employee with tools. They were somebody that they can lean on, that you can lean on. Was there any examples with any companies that you've worked with or even consulted with?
Well, it was, yes, there was one on the 7 minute in and out. That's one example. I was like, what? We can do that? Like, oh my gosh. Because we were having this situation where employees were clocking in 15 minutes early to the start of their shift to put on, safety shoes, smocks, all that stuff. And we knew it didn't take 15 minutes, but like, how are we, we felt like we're communicating this, and especially today, it's like new employees come through. This was a site that had many temporary workers. Like, how were we managing that? And it's like, we got to do that in combination with technology. So just, again, this HR team member just helped to provide the tools. And that same person also helped with the reporting. So in this weekly meeting, they provided the information of the individuals, by department, et cetera, and just made it really, really easy for us.
It really puts me in, a great spot to talk a little bit about what happens, the implications that HR mostly needs to deal with if unauthorized overtime does happen, right? And it definitely happens. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience can understand that. This next slide is a really awesome slide that we put together on unauthorized overtime FAQs, right? Like, talking about what happens when it happens. Like, what FLSA laws do I need to comply with? What does payment look like? Compensation, all that good stuff. So, Woody, my question for you is, given your experience, what happens if an employee goes overtime without authorization from their management or HR? Who is liable at the end of the day?
Yeah, Meredith, correct me if you feel I'm wrong. At the end of the day, the employer is 100% accountable here, even if you didn't authorize it. They worked the time.
Absolutely.
You have to pay it. Now it's, what are you going to do afterwards? And it's back to this communication. How well are your guidelines around overtime authorization? Did the employee know of what those rules, guidelines are? Is this a coaching? Are you disciplining? But you still have to pay that overtime.
Mm-hmm. I think it's such a good point, talking about, at the end of the day, it's on the company, it's on the employer, it's on leadership. It's so important to reiterate that 100 times over, because, again, Woody, we were talking about this prior to even hitting record, right? When it comes to employees, sometimes they think, oh, I'm doing a good deed. I'm logging in extra hours. I'm a star student. I deserve that A plus in terms of work ethic. And at the end of the day, pulling them aside and telling them, hey, you can't do that. Sometimes it sucks because you want to reward them. But at the end of the day, it's costing everybody labor dollars. It's costing it out of the organization's pockets, essentially.
Yeah.
So my question for you is, how can leadership and management develop a better understanding of these regulations surrounding unauthorized overtime compensation? Because I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding around it.
Yeah. To build on your earlier point, the sanitation example I used, that is one that will forever stick with me. I've used with teams before of employer-employee best of intent. Employees are trying to like work through sanitation. Employers like, this is awesome. The teams want to do that. But at the end of the day, it was a 6-figure payout. And it's like, that is painful. Like, seriously? Like, it was all of best of intentions. And what resulted out of that was more scripted in terms of who, when, where. Some employees weren't necessarily happy with that, but they understood why that was happening. The answer to the question is, this is another place where HR teams can help the rest of the organization, is inform on why those guidelines are in place and what those guidelines are. For example, this in California, if somebody's not taking a full half an hour, we're going to be paying an hour extra.
Yeah.
That was discovered. You had mentioned like sometimes employees come forward. That was an employee coming forward to tell us that was happening, like a new employee. I think this is why it's important, like HR professionals, to every so often do some labor law seminars, those type of things. Stay very equipped. If you have legal counsel, within your organization, to lean on them also. But this is where the HR teams can really help.
There's actually an example, and again, talking about leaning on compliance teams, a lawyer, somebody external to the company who can actually kind of supply that information. We have a tool called the compliance tool on workforce side of things. And there's an article on the site with one of our clients, Amenity Collective. They're a 10,000 staff company, primarily within the hospitality industry. They do a lot across the board. You could kind of get a little bit more of a read on it on the site. But Nicole, who is their HR manager, she was talking a lot about using the compliance tool and actually applying the FLSA specific laws as a template within the compliance tool. And it pretty much sets out their schedule completely compliant to begin with, right? So there's no hesitancy. It's almost like having a lawyer in your back pocket, right? Where there's, specific states are applied to wherever the locations are. And there's, for Amenity Collective, locations across the US, right? They're not just within one state. So making sure that, hey, every manager, Nicole's like, as head of, HR management, she's like making sure that every manager has this template specific to their state already in their back pocket. So that way, when they make their schedules, automatically it's already compliant, it's already in place. So that way, all they need to do is whenever they get their alert on the workforce app saying, hey, this person hasn't clocked out yet, this person's going overtime, this person needs to take their break, they know that the schedule that they've already lined up is completely compliant with FLSA violations and laws. So yeah, it's knowing when to lean on tools, on external resources, on other people and other teams, and saying, how can I make sure from the get-go that I'm compliant? Because at the end of the day, managers and the organizations themselves almost need to feel like they're the bigger person. They need to be the ones that say, all right, we got to pay up for this, because there's no way out, if the employee, like, even if they think that they're doing a good thing, we're the ones that are held accountable. We're the ones that get our wrist slapped, and it's almost like being the bigger person. So instead, backtracking even further than that and saying, let's make sure from the get-go that our schedules are compliant.
Yeah, I love that. The self-reflection of just like, what is it we didn't do as an organization, as an HR team, ops, sales, whoever, what is it we didn't do to either effectively communicate or help employees understand those guidelines. Another thing I'd throw out there is I've personally negotiated labor contracts, some of the funner parts of my job, but I learned a lot about labor law because usually it's more buttoned up. I'll just say in my experience. So if you have an organization where there are non-union and union areas, like leverage that kind of some of those union sites in terms of understanding of what some of those labor laws are. In my experience, they might have a better understanding.
That's a really great point. That's such a good point. I want to close out by asking my favorite question at the end of each webinar. What are 1 or 2 top tips, actions, or takeaways that our audience can walk away with to better stop unauthorized overtime hours?
Yeah. All right. We're going to go 3. One
Let's
is this communicate the schedules, who, what, where. Make it very visible. Second, leverage the technology that you've got, time clocks, etc. Communicate those changes. I think of an example where when we did the 7 minutes before and after, we piloted in an area and we communicated to our employees that's what we were doing and wanted to see how it goes, work out the positives, the negatives before we just went full site. So leverage that technology. And third, establish an overtime goal that HR and other departments share. And so you're working on this together. You're engaging frontline leaders and approval processes, etc. So communicate, leverage the technology, establish a goal.
I love it. Woody, thank you so much for coming on. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did too. This is all very, very important, pertinent information. So guys, make sure that you subscribe for more videos like this. And Woody, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, until next time, everybody have a great rest of your day.